Last week, I was able to play about 7 hours of Crimson Desert at a creator and press event, including the first 4 hours of the game, which I was allowed to record and show you in this video. And between that, also playing some later game saves for a few hours, and sitting down for a chat with the Crimson Desert team to ask some of the biggest questions we still have about this game, I now have a much better idea of what Crimson Desert actually plays like, and I have a bunch of new details to share with you. I'm also running a giveaway for a copy of the game, and I'll have all the details on that at the end of the video. I think everyone's biggest question about Crimson Desert is essentially, what does it actually play like, and is it actually as good as it looks? We have seen quite a bit of gameplay through trailers already, but what is it actually like when you get your hands on it? And specifically, what games would it be comparable to? Well, after getting hands on at the event, the simplest way I can put my initial impression is that it feels like a hybrid of Elden Ring and Zelda Breath of the Wild, and also kind of The Witcher. But it also has elements of games like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Monster Hunter. What the heck do I mean by that? Well, I say it's like Elden Ring because a huge part of the game is about exploring a massive fantasy setting open world and experimenting with lots of gear and gameplay systems. Elden Ring is sort of the poster child example I can give you, but you could argue a better example in some ways might be Nioh 3, Skyrim, or perhaps even Black Myth Wukong, although obviously Wukong is not an open world. But what all of those games have in common that Crimson Desert definitely has are deep gameplay systems, and specifically systems that you only get a limited explanation of at the start, and then you're left to kind of untangle the rest on your own. The point I'm trying to get across here is that Crimson Desert does not hold your hand, and that's the biggest thing it has in common with those games. You're not completely thrown into a massive world without any tutorials or guidance, but that is almost the case. You will be taught the basics at the start, and you will have clear direction on the next Golden Path mission, but there are so many systems and mechanics beyond the basics that you won't be directly shown, and also so much to do off the beaten path. To fully engage with the game, you're going to have to explore, discover, and experiment a lot on your own. And from speaking with the team, this is all very intentional. The game is literally designed to be experimented with, and they want the community to organically discover lots of things as opposed to giving you a lot of direction while you're playing. You're very much encouraged to talk with other players and get help and share tips. But because I'm making the comparison, I also want to be clear that Crimson Desert is not like Elden Ring in some important ways. First of all, it's not a Souls-like. You don't collect any sort of Souls currency that you get one chance to pick up after dying, and you also won't find bonfires to use as checkpoints. There are checkpoints and also separate fast travel warp points around the world, but they aren't bonfires. The storytelling is also not as cryptic as Elden Ring. It's much more forward, with more cutscenes, character development, and a clearer narrative. We'll talk more about the story in a minute though, because there's definitely more to break down there. But Crimson Desert is also not like Elden Ring in its combat system. It's faster paced and more action oriented. That's where I would compare it more to Nioh 3 or Black Myth Wukong, although really it's even faster and more fluid than those games too. There is stamina management, but it didn't feel particularly punishing to me, especially since it looked like you'd be able to upgrade the maximum stamina quite a bit. The overall combat also didn't feel as tough as what most Souls fans would expect. That's not to say I got the impression it was easy. There's definitely skill required, especially if you want to master the many advanced combos and utilize all the different mechanics to their fullest, which there are a ton of. But I think most people will find it easier than Elden Ring and other Souls games. Personally, I really prefer this more agile and proactive combat system because it gives me a lot of options to play with in real time. Not that Elden Ring or Nioh don't give you options, they certainly do, but I often feel in Souls games that a lot of the experimentation and build crafting happens in menus to prepare before going into a fight, whereas in Crimson Desert you have more freedom to adjust your strategy and experiment in the middle of combat. The world of Crimson Desert also isn't as dark fantasy as Elden Ring, and also most of the time it doesn't feel as high fantasy. At least that was my impression of the first few hours of the game. That said, when I was able to dive into a later game save for a boss fight, that was a darker setting and also felt closer to high fantasy. I can't show you footage of that unfortunately, but it was moments like these where I got a little bit more of the Witcher or Skyrim vibe. And I also got that vibe from just exploring the open world as well, which is absolutely massive and definitely holds all kinds of secrets to discover. And that's where Breath of the Wild comes in as well. Again, to really get the most out of Crimson Desert, you're going to need to head off the beaten path and just explore. Not only that, but there's quite a bit of environmental puzzle solving and platforming to do where, again, you'll be taught some of the basic mechanics, but most of it seems to be left for you to figure out by trial and error. The stamina gauge floating next to Cliff also, of course, reminds me of Breath of the Wild, especially since you can climb almost anything in this game and you'll need to manage stamina when doing so. You've also got what seems to be a pretty extensive cooking system that can give you various types of boosts in addition to food items being used for basic healing. You can experiment with finding your own recipes or unlock recipes through exploration, and it also looked like it was possible to simply buy food from vendors. But I did also notice that health regenerates automatically outside of combat, which was nice to see since I personally don't love needing to go back to a settlement or a camp to cook or purchase food every time my health is low. But probably the biggest way Crimson Desert is like Breath of the Wild is simply, again, the level of experimentation available to you, both in solving puzzles while exploring and in combat. And also the lack of handholding along with the other games already mentioned on that point. Honestly, I'm pretty confident the lack of handholding will be divisive. Not a bad thing, but it's going to be very interesting to see who bounces off Crimson Desert and who doesn't. It's the sort of game that really demands you're willing to put in a lot of time into it to figure out how to use certain items, solve specific puzzles, and leverage its particular systems and mechanics. For some people, that type of thing is just really frustrating, but if experimentation is your thing and you actively don't want anyone holding your hand, then I think you'll like Crimson Desert a lot. But I also mentioned Kingdom Come Deliverance and Monster Hunter. I mentioned KCD really only because it's the best recent analog for how the game initially presents. And by that I mean it gives the immediate impression as a more traditional medieval setting as opposed to high fantasy. I'm mostly referring to what settlements and NPC inhabitants look like, but it's definitely not medieval realism all the way through. Not even close. There are various fantasy races, and you'll quickly learn that there's a whole thing going on with those floating islands in the sky that's very much not grounded in reality. Plus, Cliff obtains a variety of magical and supernatural abilities that you'll use in combat and exploration. And then I mentioned Monster Hunter for one very specific reason. You're not going out and repeatedly fighting monsters to obtain parts used for gear upgrades in Crimson Desert. It's not like Monster Hunter in that way. The element of Monster Hunter I see in this game is the depth and complexity of the controls, and that's another area where I can see certain groups of people bouncing off the game. Getting the basic controls under your belt is easy, but there are a ton of contextual controls, which you can see pop up in the bottom right of the screen as you're doing things. Just to give you a simple example, I figured out you can do not just a double jump, not a triple jump, not even a quadruple jump, but a full-on quintuple jump that's 5 times if you string together Cliff's regular double jump with one of his unlockable abilities. And that's just a simple one. You can do all sorts of crazy stuff like catapulting yourself into the air using the grappling tool and a bunch of other combos that just go multiple layers deep. So there's definitely some finger gymnastics required to fully utilize everything, whether you're on keyboard and mouse or controller. That said, I did also notice that the basic attack combos were quite simple to pull off, and they were effective enough against regular enemies and mini-bosses that you don't have to break your fingers just to get some basic combat done. In fact, you can actually just hold down R1 or R2 on the controller, and Cliff will automatically do the most basic combos for you. And yes, if you're playing on controller, light and heavy attack will be R1 and R2. At launch, controller mapping will not be customizable, and there will only be one control scheme available, no other presets to switch to. If you're playing with keyboard and mouse, you will be able to remap, but not on controller, at least not at launch. I did talk with the Crimson Desert team about this, and they're looking at the possibility of adding more controller mapping options, but if that happens, it will be sometime after launch. Honestly though, once you see how many layers there are to the controls and how much they're trying to squeeze onto the limited buttons on a controller, it makes sense why they're limiting it to one control scheme right now. Being able to remap freely would be daunting, but I do hope they can add some additional preset options at some point. There are also some kind of strange things with the controls that will definitely throw people off until you get used to them. For example, there's so many things you can interact with in this world that in order to talk to some NPCs, you actually need to hold L1 and then position the glowing selector over the NPC to select them and then hit square to interact with them. It makes sense why they did this once you see how much stuff you can interact with, because you'd constantly be like picking up stuff off a table instead of talking to the person you're trying to talk to, but it's also definitely something you have to get used to. There are some cool extras they added in with the controls though. Like I noticed you can actually toggle the field of view through 5 different levels, even going into first person view by just pressing on the touchpad on a DualSense controller. I found this while trying to find a photo mode actually, but the team confirmed to me that there will not be a photo mode at launch. Like control customization, that's something they're looking at possibly adding later. And it's the same story with New Game Plus. That won't be available at launch either, but something they're potentially looking at later. But honestly, you should not need New Game Plus for a very long time. No joke, I think it's going to take dozens of hours just to get your head wrapped around how everything works and get a sense for all the things you can do. And then it'll probably literally take hundreds of hours to complete everything. I barely scratched the surface in the 7 hours I had with it. So let's talk about exploration and how you're going to interact with the world of Crimson Desert. Of course, you can explore on foot, and you've probably seen the footage of Cliff gliding, but he can also use various mounts to get around faster, and there are fast travel warp points like I mentioned before. You can climb almost anything anything as long as you can manage your stamina, and that includes towers and castle walls. So you can, for example, bypass guards who won't let you through the front door. And I know a lot of people are curious how many of the buildings you can actually go in, and the answer is actually most of them. I was kind of surprised. Not only can you go in most of the buildings you see, but you can actually sometimes find interesting stuff in there. Like at one point, I found this sort of puzzle-locked safe, and I couldn't figure out how to get into it, but it probably contained some good loot if I could figure out how to open it. And then there are actually quite a few locked doors as well that you need to find a key to open. I didn't manage to find many keys in the limited time I had, but again, just another layer to this world that makes it more engaging to explore. Puzzles and puzzle mechanics are a pretty big part of exploration too. There are various environmental puzzles to solve that require moving objects around or connecting circuitry to make electrical-like energy flow from one point to another. There's also a fair amount of platforming you'll need to do, which I know will drive some people crazy, especially because sometimes it takes place super high up on the floating islands, and if you fall, you are going all the way down. Cliff can fly, so it's not like you'll die, but you will have to get back up there, and if you didn't unlock a warp point up there before you fell, well, you're in for a long journey back up. And it does sometimes take a while to get up there. Like at one point, I took a levitating platform up, and it literally took probably a solid minute or more to go from ground level up to the island in the abyss. I remember thinking this would be a pretty good time to get a snack. There's also some puzzling to do with specific gear you'll unlock that lets you view memories, and the basic lantern is also important for locating hidden things you need to interact with. And even during the limited time I had, I could just tell there are a bunch of other mechanics you can play with to interact with the environment. Like at one point, the game shows you can create fire arrows by literally holding an arrow over a brazier and then burn down vines by shooting them with it. But Cliff also has this mechanic where he can reflect light off his blade, which gets used for a few different things, but you can actually burn things with that too. And I didn't really have enough opportunities to experiment with it fully, but it definitely looked like you could temporarily blind enemies with that as well. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about when I say you need to experiment and explore. There's just so many different little systems and mechanics that interact with each other, and it's cool figuring out useful and fun things you can do. And what you'll notice with quests specifically is that you will typically have a clear final objective presented to you, but you're going to have to figure out all the steps to get to that end goal. The game isn't really going to guide you through each step of a quest. Again, some people will love that and others will find it frustrating because you can easily end up spending a lot of time trying to figure out what you're supposed to do. A few other random gameplay things, I did also notice the inventory gets full pretty fast and that more inventory space gets unlocked by helping out townsfolk with various tasks. This is something I worry could become kind of frustrating because there's a ton of stuff to pick up everywhere you go, but it seemed like you need to do quite a few mundane tasks for townsfolk to get significantly more inventory space. I could be wrong about that though. Maybe there's other systems that unlock a bunch of inventory space more quickly, and there also may be some kind of stash mechanic at the camp. You do unlock the camp pretty early where you can farm and cook and other things like that, so I would not be surprised if there's some kind of stash there. I just don't know for sure because I didn't have a lot of time to explore the camp. You can actually also change time of day by sleeping in a bed or at a campfire, although there's a cooldown on this, so you have to wait to do it again. And there is fall damage in this game, so even though Cliff can fly, flying costs stamina, so you're going to have to be a bit careful with managing how far you're trying to fly and how far above the ground you are. But one of the things you're definitely going to want to go out exploring for are abyss artifacts. There are tons of these scattered around the world, and you need them to unlock Cliff's abilities. But it was also cool to see that some skills could actually also be learned through observing an NPC doing them. And it did look like you could respec your abyss artifacts to reallocate them and unlock different abilities. So for example, if you had already unlocked an ability by consuming a few abyss artifacts, but then you come across the NPC where you could learn that ability through observation, you can take the abyss artifacts back, learn that ability through observation, and then use the abyss artifacts for another ability. The abyss artifacts get used to unlock the abilities for the secondary characters as well, and I know people are curious about what the limits are for what you can do with those guys. I only had a few minutes with them, but I did find some new things and got some additional info on them. So in addition to the unique weapon classes we already knew about, they do each have their own unique abilities too. But there's also quite a bit of overlap here, so even though they each feel distinct, especially because of their unique weapon classes, you can sort of fall back on the basic combat mechanics with any one of them because they share a set of core abilities and can equip a lot of similar functioning weapons in addition to their unique ones. It's also been revealed previously that these characters unlock through main story progression, and they can be used for any open world content you want. But it sounds like they will also be playable for parts of the main story. I'm guessing for specific parts designed for them, but not the whole story. When you want to switch to one of them, you basically summon them to your location, and then you can freely swap between who you're controlling. It actually seemed like the two non-player characters would follow you around a bit, but I'm not sure they'll follow you very far or actually help you in combat. I'm guessing not, but to me, that's not really a big deal. I just think it's cool that you have the freedom to play as these different characters for open world content, and it's cool they each have their own unique weapon classes and abilities too. But for the main story, you will need to play through most of it as Cliff. And the overall emphasis of narrative elements might be a divisive aspect for the game for some people too. I'm reserving final judgment on the story until I'm able to publish my full review, which I will have for you about a day before launch, because I was only able to play the first 4 hours of the game, and I don't feel I got a good enough sample of the story. Clearly there is a story, and there are some interesting characters you already meet in the first few hours. But right now, based on a limited time with the game, I definitely don't think storytelling is going to be on the same level as something like Expedition 33, The Witcher, Cyberpunk Horizon, or God of War. The story is much clearer and less obtuse than something like Elden Ring, but I also don't think story or super interesting characters is what this game is going to be known for. My impression right now is it's basically a pretty average narrative experience for an action-adventure game. Not particularly bad, but also not especially strong. And I also don't think it's going to have the same level of lore or world narrative to uncover as something like Elden Ring. I'll definitely update you on this in my full review. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised, but that's my impression right now. But I gotta say, I was actually surprised that I cared about the lack of a fantastic narrative less than I thought. I personally do prefer games with a really strong narrative, but I was so engaged by the amount of other stuff I could do that I wasn't that concerned about it. Before the event, I was worried Crimson Desert might end up feeling like a giant open world amusement park with a bunch of different interesting things to do, but nothing really tying them all together. The thing is, it is kind of a big amusement park, but it doesn't feel as disconnected as I thought it might, and at least in the 7 hours I spent with it, I was having enough fun exploring and trying a bunch of things out that I wasn't really too concerned about how exactly it all fit together. I think it still remains to be seen if that continues to be fun for dozens or hundreds of hours though, so that's something I want to come back to in my full review as well. But something that I definitely liked was combat. We touched on combat before, but there are a few more details you should know about, including some cool stuff about gear. The combat system is very much built around the ability tree, which is split into 3 branches: stamina, health, and spirit. And spirit is where all the magic abilities come in. In addition to a bunch of melee combos, Cliff and the other characters do also have a fair amount of magic-based abilities that you can weave into combat as well, which is pretty cool. Magic abilities are powered by the spirit gauge down near the health bar. And I was also happy to see that weapons do go beyond just having basic stats like power and speed. Some of them also have special attributes and abilities shown in their descriptions, which you'll definitely want to consider for builds. And then you've also got slots on weapons for Abyss cores, which are your mods to customize weapons with different stat balances and special enhancements. Weapons can also have a refinement level, meaning you can basically upgrade them to make them stronger. And overall, it definitely looks like there's a lot of gear in the game to find and play around with. How much variety there is something I want to check out more, but given how much there is, I think there should be a pretty healthy variety. It's also worth mentioning that I couldn't really find a way to stealth. Not saying it's not possible, in fact there's a decent chance there is a way given how many different systems are in this game, but at the same time I wouldn't be surprised if stealth isn't particularly viable. It just doesn't really feel like the combat system was built with stealth in mind. And I also noticed that times when fighting regular enemies that they would sort of just stand around and wait for me to attack, which didn't feel very engaging. It's possible this was a bit of a bug though, because we were obviously playing a pre-release build and it didn't happen all the time. The one boss fight I did get to try, which I can't show you because it's too spoilery, was pretty cool. Between that and the boss fights I've seen in various trailers, I think there should be some pretty unique bosses to take on, and probably a bunch of them given how massive this game is. But let's talk performance. I gotta say, I was actually pretty impressed with how well the game ran, especially since the build I played wasn't the final version. I was keeping an eye out for things like dramatic frame rate drops, especially in combat, and I wanted to see if I noticed pop-in of terrain or NPCs while exploring. I can't say I really noticed any dramatic frame rate drops at any time, which is awesome. I did have one instance where an NPC wagon popped in at the other end of a bridge I was crossing. That one was pretty noticeable, but I didn't ever see it happen again with any other NPCs. And there were a few really minor instances of a tree here or there in the distance popping in, but honestly, I only noticed those because I was literally climbing up to high places and looking around trying to force the game to render a bunch of stuff. If I wasn't looking for it, I wouldn't have noticed it at all. Crimson Desert has some really impressive draw distances with tons of stuff rendering. And there's also a lot of particle effects during combat combat, lots of vegetation while exploring, cloth blowing in the wind in many locations, and just a lot of detail all over the place. So the fact that it was running a solid 70 to 80 FPS all the time on a 1440p ultra-wide monitor was pretty impressive, especially since that was 1440p native. They didn't have any upscaler turned on, no DLSS, nothing. Just raw 3440 by 1440p with all the settings cranked up to max and ray tracing effects on as well. Now, I did peek the CPU and GPU specs, and we were playing on pretty powerful PCs, but I was still impressed. They had us on 9800 X3D CPUs and 9070 XT GPUs. A 9070 XT is in the same ballpark as the previous generation AMD 7900 XTX or an NVIDIA 5070 Ti or 4080. So definitely a killer CPU and a pretty powerful GPU. But even so, with all the graphics settings maxed out, ray tracing on, and no upscaling, a consistent 70 to 80 FPS on an ultra-wide 1440p was pretty impressive. So with more optimized settings, turning on an upscaler, and or running the game on a regular 1440p instead of an ultra-wide or using 1080p, performance would of course be even better. Of course, Digital Foundry did their review if you want to dive deeper on performance. But what about PS5? Everyone wants to know what console performance for this game looks like. I did ask about this, and I was told that PS5 footage will be released before launch. No details beyond that, but I'm glad to hear we'll be able to check out PS5 performance before the game is out. Speaking of platforms, like I mentioned earlier, I'll be giving away a copy of the game, and that will be on the platform of your choice if you win. So make sure you're subscribed and then check out the instructions in the pinned comment below for all the details and to get additional entries. And also subscribe to make sure you don't miss my full review and all the tips and tricks I'll be putting out for this game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.